Welcome to part 2 of the Subcontractor Scope of Work series. I'm Jason Smith and I'll be leading you through this course. In this second session of the 3-part series, we'll concentrate on the following: structural steel, the various trades associated with the building envelope, and some of the more convoluted miscellaneous specialties trades. Like part 1, this course will be presented as a series of examples. I've always found examples to be much more interesting and informative than long drawn-out theoretical discussions. Okay, let's get started. We'll begin this second session with the structural steel trade. This sub is typically on the critical path from the day a notice to proceed is issued, through submittals, procurement, fabrication, erection, and all the way to the day that they're complete and demobilize. Our first subject will be the division of work between the structural steel and miscellaneous metal subcontractors. Primary steel will always be by the structural steel subcontractor. Primary steel is defined as the building structure, steel that supports the building itself. Basically, if removing a piece of steel would cause the building to fall down, that's primary steel. This steel will always be shown in the structural drawings. Secondary steel will be by the miscellaneous metal subcontractor. Secondary steel is the steel that supports building components as opposed to the building itself. This might include a structural steel grid for precast panels, a steel frame for coiling doors, metal stairs, or even steel supports for ceiling-hung toilet partitions. Now, the majority of secondary steel is not in the structural drawings. Most of it is in the architectural drawings. As a general rule, and just a general rule, if the steel is fully designed in the structural drawings, the structural steel subcontractor will usually pick it up. If the steel is not fully designed in the structural drawings, or shown elsewhere in the document, such as the architecturals, the miscellaneous metal subcontractor typically picks it up. Now, this can be a real hodgepodge of work, especially for the miscellaneous metal sub. But this is only a general rule, a very loose general rule, and there are many exceptions to it. So let's look at an example of an exception. If the secondary steel in question can be quickly and efficiently erected in conjunction with the primary steel, then the structural steel subcontractor should include it. A common example here is the support steel for elevator guide rails, and also the often overlooked hoist beam at the top of the elevator shaft. Now, this elevator steel is usually shown on the structural drawings, but both structural steel and miscellaneous metals bidders have a habit of excluding it. This is a very common scope bust. As another example, let's look at the major facade steel that's shown in this photo. This is, by definition, secondary steel, but it's much more efficiently erected in conjunction with the primary steel, so it's more appropriate for the structural steel subcontractor to pick this up. This definitely needs to be allocated to the structural steel subcontractor via the bid instructions, otherwise they're highly likely to exclude it. Next, we'll discuss some commonly overlooked scope issues that are associated with the structural steel trade. It's best to use steel templates in lieu of wood for the anchor bolts, and these steel templates will be provided by the structural steel subcontractor. Steel templates are much more accurate and reliable than wood templates, and they've become commonplace these days. However, as commonplace as it may be, if this isn't addressed in the bid instructions, the structural steel bidders will assume wood templates are being furnished by the formwork sub, and conversely, formwork bidders will assume steel templates are being furnished by the steel sub. Of course, formwork subcontractors will always include setting the templates, but if this isn't in the bid instructions, we'll have a scope bust for furnishing the material and fabricating the templates. A second scope issue related to anchor bolt templates that I think is worth mentioning here is that you should only use one template per set of bolts. Don't try to reuse those templates. The templates get really beat up during pours, especially when they're stripped. And this is true for the steel templates as well. As sturdy as they may look, they do get banged up during concrete pours, and especially, as I mentioned, when they're stripped. Permits for the erection crane, including the wide load trucking permits, lane closure permits, and FAA permits, should be the full responsibility of the structural steel subcontractor. What I'm talking about here are the lattice boom crawler cranes. We often need a wide load trucking permit to get those things to and from the site, and that massive boom needs to be assembled on the ground. So when there's not sufficient space on site to assemble it, we need to do it in the street, and in that case we'll need a lane closure permit. And remember, it may look like you have enough room on site to assemble that boom, but keep in mind that this thing is so large that it's going to disrupt the other trades by creating a massive obstacle in the middle of the site. Once the boom is lifted up in the air, it's up and out of the way. But during assembly and disassembly on the ground, that thing takes up a lot of space. These cranes are so tall that they're often hazards to helicopters, and when they are, we need an FAA permit for them. Now, in addition to the cost of these permits, be sure preparing and all the time associated with procuring the permits is also addressed. Procuring the permits in particular can take a tremendous amount of time down at the city office. If the general contractor does not delegate permit procurement amongst the various subs needing permits, that general contractor is going to end up spending a lot of time waiting in line down at the city. And this time spent dealing with subcontractor permits would be much better spent on site managing the project than sitting in a chair down at a city office waiting for your number to come up. Be sure touch-up of the prime painting at all the welds of the structural steel is allocated to either the structural steel or painting subcontractor. Both of these subs exclude this touch-up painting regularly. The structural steel sub will always include prime painting of the structural steel when prime painting is required, but they won't include the touch-up paint. Now, most GCs do have the painter do this touch-up paint, which is fine. Once again, the important thing is that this touch-up painting is covered, but not double covered. And this needs to be addressed in the bid instructions, otherwise, as I mentioned, both of these subs will exclude it. Additionally, be sure that the bid instructions don't just call for the touch-up painting itself, but the subcontractors must also include all means of access to get to these points. Remember, the floor decks will not be in place at the time that this painting needs to occur, so we're going to need scissor lifts or boom lifts to get up there. The painting itself is easy. Those boom lifts and scissor lifts are expensive. It is important to establish who sets the first leveling nut at each group of column anchor bolts. Leveling nuts are the nuts at the underside of a column base plate, and they're used to fine-tune the base plate elevation and column plumbness. They're located in the grout space under the base plate. Setting that first nut to elevation is a common exclusion by structural steel bidders because it requires the services of a surveyor, which isn't cheap. The way this works is that a surveyor will set the first nut to elevation, and then the structural steel sub will use a common handheld level to align the remaining nuts in that group. So that first nut is pretty expensive, but the rest are easy. The structural steel sub will always include setting the rest of the nuts with a common level, but that first expensive nut is the one they exclude. Now, if the general contractor wants to take responsibility for setting that first nut to elevation, that's no problem. They can do that just fine. The important thing is that it's covered, but not double covered. Welding equipment draws a tremendous amount of power. This load is commonly so great that it overloads the project temporary power. Therefore, to avoid this overload, the structural steel sub may need to provide a generator for their welding equipment. Notably, miscellaneous metals and metal decking subcontractors are two other trades that commonly need to provide generators. And once again, if this is not addressed in the bid instructions, the subcontractors will exclude generators. Next, we'll jump to the metal decking scope of work and discuss some of the items associated with the metal decking trade that need to be coordinated with other trades. Hoisting of the metal decking from the truck up into the building is traditionally performed by the structural steel subcontractor. This is simply because the hoisting is quick and the structural steel sub already has a crane right there at the ready. This is a common practice and it's rarely a problem, but I did want to mention it because it's very unique for one subcontractor to pick up hoisting for another. I can't think of another case in which this occurs. The responsibility for deck penetrations through a metal deck can be a very contentious issue. These penetrations commonly require steel angle or channel frames, and these frames are commonly provided by the structural steel or miscellaneous metal subcontractors. Now, I typically prefer to have the structural steel sub do it because these frames can be easily and efficiently erected in conjunction with the rest of the structural steel, but you can have the miscellaneous metal sub do it as well. The important thing, once again, is to be sure it's covered, but not double covered. Many of you know that these deck penetrations are a very contentious issue. The problem with deck penetrations for MEP work in particular is that the deck openings are not always shown on the structural drawings. The reality is, we sometimes only have standard details in the structural drawings showing how these deck penetrations are to be constructed, but they're not located on the structural plans. We have to look through the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing drawings to find them. Now, this is a very contentious debate between architects and general contractors. Architects commonly hold that this is a means and methods issue, and it's the general contractor's responsibility to coordinate the deck penetrations between the MEP drawings and the structurals. And conversely, the general contractor commonly holds that this is a document coordination issue and needs to be completed by the design team. Either way, these penetrations are a part of the project, and we need to deal with them. Now, I'm not going to discuss this debate here because this debate is something that can be discussed for hours on end. But what I do want to discuss in this course on the nuts and bolts of construction is the fact of the matter that structural steel and miscellaneous metals subcontractors will not look at the mechanical, electrical, or plumbing drawings to pick up this work on their own accord. We need to address it very clearly in the bid instructions. And I'll tell you, it's a lot easier to deal with this in the bid instructions than it is to fight it out with the architect and subcontractors after the project has been awarded. Now, the general contractors watching this course right now are going to be shaking their heads saying, this is a design issue. We need to make the architect do it. And you know what? I do agree with you. But what I want to address here is the fact of the matter that this is a contentious debate. And although you could probably win the debate, what I want to do is help you prevent the debate from occurring in the first place. I want to take this off the table early in the project before bids are received. As I discuss in my ethics course, the only way to truly win a debate is to prevent the debate from having to occur in the first place. And that's the goal. So please, be proactive and do what you can to address this issue with the bid instructions. Edge containment and metal decking could be provided by a number of different subcontractors. First, it's important to understand the division of work between the gauge metal and steel trades. Gauge metal trades include, among others, the framing, metal decking, and flashing subcontractors, while the steel trades include the miscellaneous metals and structural steel subcontractors. The division of work between these two subs is between 10 gauge material and 1/8-inch steel material. 1/8-inch steel is just slightly thicker than 10 gauge, just barely. This is a good dividing line between the union jurisdictions of these different trades. Anything 1/8 of an inch or thicker will be by the steel trades, and anything 10 gauge or thinner will be by the gauge metal trades, aka the sheet metal trades. Gauge metal edge forms are routinely provided by the metal decking subcontractor. These gauge metal forms, or deck closures as they're commonly termed, will be used when the deck has only a slight cantilever over the structural beam. Steel edge forms are usually provided by the structural steel subcontractor, but may also be allocated to the miscellaneous metals sub. Because this steel can be efficiently erected in conjunction with the rest of the primary steel, I typically find it best to put this in the structural steel bid instructions as opposed to the mis metals bid instructions. But of course the important thing is that this work is covered but not double covered. There are two common reasons that we use steel edge forms in lieu of the gauge metal closures. One common reason is if the metal decking cantilevers a significant distance beyond the steel beam, as shown in the photo at the right. This cantilever is too long to be supported by gauge metal. Gauge metal just isn't structurally sufficient for long cantilevers like this. And a second reason that we would use steel edge forms is when we need to support heavy facade systems off the edge of the deck, such as a curtain wall or GFRC panels. These facade systems often need a steel plate at the edge of the deck to weld to. Let's talk about the division of work for miscellaneous metals a little more deeply. The miscellaneous metal scope is one of, if not the, most difficult scope to write. Now, as previously mentioned, if steel is fully designed in the structural drawings, it's typically provided by the structural steel subcontractor. And any steel that's not fully designed in the structural drawings is typically by the miscellaneous metal sub. But this is not by any means a steadfast rule. Interestingly, because the miscellaneous metal scope is such a vast array of miscellaneous steel items, miscellaneous metals bidders have become accustomed to searching high and low through the drawings to find the miscellaneous steel work. Miscellaneous steel is in no way, shape, or form organized in the drawings, and the mis metal subcontractors specialize in this vast hodgepodge of steel components. Now, it takes a lot of experience to become an expert at miscellaneous metals, but I'd like to give you a couple more rules of thumb to help narrow your focus when you're preparing the mis metals bid instructions. Custom steel fabrications are usually provided by the mis metal sub. This includes elevator pit ladders, metal stairs, custom railings, pipe bollards, brick ledger angles, in-wall counter supports, coiling door support steel, embedded angles around a dock leveler, and I could go on all day with this list. Custom steel fabrications of this nature are usually provided by the miscellaneous metal subcontractor. Mass manufactured steel fabrications that are specified within Division 5 are normally provided by the mis metal subcontractor. This might include stair nosings or off-the-shelf railing assemblies. However, mass manufactured steel fabrications that are specified in any division other than Division 5 are normally provided by another trade. These might include park benches that are provided by the landscape sub, manufactured bollards that are also provided by the landscape sub, or stainless steel corner guards that are provided by a specialty subcontractor. Next, we'll move to the precast concrete scope of work. And the first thing I'd like to address with regard to this subcontractor is to define the two different types of precast concrete. Although they have greatly different purposes, the same precast subcontractor typically provides both the structural and architectural precast. Architectural precast is usually panelized on a building facade or even in landscape elements like seat walls and planter walls. Structural precast is used for odd-shaped repetitive elements like the seating structure in a stadium, or for high or odd-shaped structural beams that are hard to form in place. The precast panels are typically supported at each corner. Precast subcontractors will provide their own steel connections, but only to a point about 6 inches behind each corner of each panel. This is a major concern for precast facades. For example, consider a structural steel building with a precast facade, and the precast panels are typically about 4 to 6 inches thick, which is a lot of weight. The primary steel structure is not likely to align perfectly with the panel connection points, so we typically need a grid of secondary steel behind the panels. The precast subcontractor will design and engineer all of their own connections, but they won't provide any work for the supporting structure behind their panels. Now, we all know that responsibility for secondary steel is a point of contention on nearly every project. In the world we live in, secondary steel for facades is sometimes shown on the drawings, but not always. But if secondary steel is shown, it's not always shown completely, and the documents may call for the general contractor to fill in the blanks and provide any and all additional steel necessary. Now, in this course, I'm not going to discuss whether or not the steel should be in the drawings. What I want to discuss here is the fact that we've got to deal with it. And as I mentioned a little while ago, the only way to truly win a debate is to prevent the debate from occurring in the first place. And that's what I want to address in this course. The miscellaneous metals subcontractor will typically provide the secondary steel grid behind a precast panel facade. The obvious dilemma here is if the steel isn't shown or is not shown completely, how do miscellaneous metals bidders know what steel is necessary prior to bidding? Well, the answer, which isn't easy, is that general contractors need to provide this preliminary direction in their bid instructions. This can be difficult because it requires coordination of the means and methods of a half a dozen precast bidders with a half a dozen miscellaneous metals bidders. For a relatively simple building, the steel will be pretty straightforward, and this is doable for the general contractor. On a complicated building, where a half a dozen precast bidders may all require different steel configurations, that would make the bidding way too convoluted. In that case, the best thing to do is have the precast subcontractor pick up their own secondary steel structures. This means the precast bidders will need to team up with their own miscellaneous metals partner and provide a single coordinated bid that includes the secondary steel structures they need. This is a good way to mitigate the general contractor's risk in this regard. And don't forget the other related bidders. For instance, because precast is traditionally a design-build scope of work, the concrete embeds may not be shown on the bid drawings either. And because a formwork subcontractor is going to need to set those embeds, the formwork bidders will need sizes and quantities of those embeds. This is just one more thing that needs to be coordinated with the design-build precast bidders. Now we'll move on to some commonly overlooked scope issues associated with the precast concrete scope of work. Field measurements are always necessary, and they should be taken by the precast subcontractor themselves. Field measurements are often found as an exclusion in precast bids, but that exclusion should never be accepted. Building structures aren't dimensionally perfect, but that's okay. That's what tape measures are for. Field measurements are necessary to adjust for construction tolerances to ensure the panels align such that the building looks dimensionally perfect. On a high-rise, the as-built structural steel dimensions might differ from the planned dimensions on the drawings by a couple of inches. Now, this may sound like a lot, but it's well within industry-standard construction tolerances. The subcontractors themselves are the most appropriate parties for this. Be sure this is in the bid instructions so that the precast subcontractor and all other subcontractors are fully responsible for the accuracy of their work. The precast sub may need to provide their own crane. Even if you have a tower crane on a project, tower cranes do not always have the capacity for large precast members. So the general contractor needs to analyze the weights of the precast members being delivered to the site and compare those to the capacity of their tower crane to verify if the precast subcontractor will be required to provide their own crane. Quite often they'll need one of the big lattice boom crawler cranes, which means they'll need wide load trucking permits, lane closure permits, and FAA permits, just like in our steel discussion. Protection measures for the precast panels after erection should be furnished by the precast subcontractor. But, because the precast subcontractor will shortly thereafter demobilize, it's most appropriate and efficient for the general contractor to maintain the protection and eventually dispose of it. In general, it's a good practice to have subcontractors provide protection for their own work. But we don't want to pay those guys to keep checking in on the site every couple of days, and for that reason, it's most appropriate and efficient for the general contractor to maintain the protection and eventually remove and dispose of the protection measures. And this is a global concern. It's not specific to precast by any means. Providing, maintaining, and eventually disposing of protection measures for building finishes and other building components is commonly overlooked and can add up to a sizable amount when you consider all the various trades. Precast subcontractors routinely exclude sealants, but one way or another that work needs to be covered. This scope could be forced on the precast subcontractor, or the general contractor could directly employ a caulking sub for this work. Most facade trades, like curtain wall and metal panel, regularly do provide their own sealants, but precast subcontractors do not. Notably, neither do the masonry or GFRC subs. Caulking and sealants may look simple and easy, but it's not cheap. If this isn't addressed, it'll be a big scope gap and a big hit to your contingency. I just have one quick slide for the metal panel scope. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this trade, but I do want to mention that there are several different subcontractors that might provide metal panels on a project. Of course, the metal panel subcontractor may provide them. Having an individual metal panel subcontractor is the usual route when we have an extensive metal panel facade. The panels you see in this photo would likely be provided by a metal panel subcontractor. The glass and glazing subcontractor will provide metal panels in two conditions. First, if the metal panels are part of a curtain wall system, as you see in this illustration, or if there's relatively few metal panels and they need to match the curtain wall or storefront mullions. If the metal panels need to match the curtain wall or storefront mullions, it makes sense to have the glass sub pick them up because that way you know the color is going to match perfectly. When we have a relatively small quantity of metal panels, but they do not need to match the glass and glazing subcontractor's work, we typically have the flashing subcontractor pick them up. Obviously, if we don't address this in the bid instructions to let the bidders know who's doing what, we're going to get scope gaps. Especially in the case of small quantities of metal panels on a project, each bidder will assume someone else is taking care of the panels. And when this happens, we end up paying for them out of the contingency. Allocating all of the glass on a project can be quite tedious. Let's discuss all the various subcontractors that deal with glass on a project. Storefronts and curtain walls will naturally be provided by the glass sub. Okay, we've got that easy one out of the way, so now we'll move on to the less obvious items. Large custom skylights are typically completed by a specialty skylight subcontractor. The skylights I'm talking about here are the large atrium skylights, where the framing is actually very typical to a curtain wall and often needs to match the curtain wall. But, even though the skylight looks nearly identical to the curtain wall, it's actually provided by a different sub. Small mass-manufactured skylights will actually be by a Miscellaneous Specialties subcontractor. These are the skylights that are about 2 feet by 4 feet, mass-manufactured, and all you do is pull them out of the box and drop them over a roof curb. They're not custom or assembled in place like the large custom skylights. Now, there's really nothing tricky about determining whether a skylight is a large custom skylight or a small mass-manufactured skylight. When you review the specifications for these items, it will be obvious to you. Interior glass may be provided by an even wider variety of subcontractors than the exterior glass. The glass in hollow metal doors and frames will be by the glass subcontractor. This glass is installed in the field, not the shop, and the Glaziers Union claims all glass work, so field installations cannot be by the door sub themselves because they're carpenters and don't typically have glaziers on their payroll. The glass in wood doors and frames might be by the glass sub, or it might be by the door subcontractor. If the glass is installed in the field, it will be by the glass subcontractor. However, unlike hollow metal doors, wood doors are often glazed in the shop, not the field. If the glazing is installed in the shop, the door subcontractor will provide it. Glass in cabinet doors is traditionally installed in the shop, so this glass will be provided by the casework subcontractor. Mirrors specified in Division 8 are your typical flat plate mirrors that are unframed. These unframed mirrors specified in Division 8 will typically be provided by the glass subcontractor. But watch out for this, because glass bidders often exclude mirrors. Mirrors specified in Division 10 will be provided by the toilet accessories subcontractor. These are the mirrors that are mass manufactured and typically come from the manufacturer with a stainless steel frame. There's no real exceptions to this, it's pretty cut and dry, but mirror responsibility is a common scope gap. Note that you may have different glass subcontractors for the interior and exterior glass, especially on hard bid public works projects. Some smaller glass companies are comfortable doing the interior glass, but don't have the capability for doing large storefronts or curtain walls. And vice versa, some of your larger glass companies will want to do the curtain walls, but don't want to bother themselves with the mirrors or hollow metal frames that need to be glazed. Next, we'll discuss the above-grade waterproofing scope of work. It's not uncommon for the same subcontractor to do below-grade waterproofing, above-grade waterproofing, and roofing. But for the point of this three-part series, let's assume that each one of these trades is being bid separately. There are many subcontractors involved and a multitude of variations when it comes to scoping above-grade waterproofing. This sub essentially gets the project leftovers. Any waterproofing that another subcontractor doesn't want to do, the above-grade waterproofing sub will pick up. Like miscellaneous metals, this can be a real hodgepodge of work. Building paper is the easy one. Building paper will always be by the respective facade subcontractor. A masonry sub will provide their own building paper behind their brick, and a plaster subcontractor will provide their own building paper behind their lath. Notably, plastic sheeting, such as Tyvek, would fall in the same category as building paper. Self-adhered sheet membrane is usually by the respective facade sub, but not always. Some of the common product names for this membrane are bituthane, Vicor, or ice and water shield. This membrane is a rubber sheet with adhesive and backing paper. You remove the backing paper and stick it to the wall, just like tape. This membrane might be called out as an upgrade to the building paper behind brick or plaster, and in the cases of brick or plaster, this membrane would most likely be installed by the above-grade waterproofing subcontractor because masonry and plaster subcontractors don't deal with this membrane. If this membrane occurs behind metal panels, the metal panel subcontractor will usually pick it up. This membrane is commonly used below cap flashings at a roof parapet, and in those conditions, the flashing sub provides it. The important thing, as always, is to be sure it's covered, but not double covered. And as you can tell from the few examples I just went over, this membrane is a common scope bust. Fluid-applied membranes will also be by the above-grade waterproofing subcontractor. These fluid-applied membranes might be roll-applied, spray-applied, or even trowel-applied. They could be found behind masonry, plaster, metal panels, or any number of facade types. The air block product falls into this category, which is a very high-quality membrane. Damp proofing also falls into this category, which is essentially a very cheap waterproofing product that we'll often find behind a facade that's applied over a concrete wall. Fluid-applied horizontal membranes will also be by the above-grade waterproofing subcontractor. These are the membranes that you commonly find on a plaza deck underneath pavers, or in planters that occur on a deck above occupied space. Water repellent painting by the Specialties water repellent. Traffic is by definition a coating provided by the above-grade water coating. These are the roll fountains, whether interior or exterior. This is a coating that's applied. Waterproofing hand would seem to imply a traffic toppings are the waterproofing. This is a coating that's applied to the lower interior of a building along typically all done by the water, so that if graffiti occurs, will always be wiped by the above-grade water. Although the term pan might seem to imply a sheet metal fabrication, these are actually a rubberized membrane similar to These are actually a rubberized bond breaker between the building facade and the graffiti. If graffiti occurs, these membranes are typically specified in the ceramic tile section, not the waterproofing section. If graffiti occurs, picked up by ceramic tile subcontractors, and if graffiti occurs, it can be quickly and easily wiped from this coating. And although this example is specific to showers, anytime a membrane is required underneath ceramic tile, the ceramic tile subcontractor will pick it up. Next, we'll move to the roofing scope. This also includes plastic sheeting laid directly. This also includes installation occurs above the structural roofing subcontractor will also include sheathing insulation building air pressure by the roofing subcontractor. The roofing subcontractor will also include sheathing below the structural roof deck. It could be rigid insulation or it could be bad insulation. But when required, the roofing subcontractor will also include the sheathing over the insulation. And if the insulation occurs below the roof deck, it will be provided by the insulation quarter-inch or half-inch thick gypsum board product. Insulation below the roof deck could be rigid for some roofing systems, or it could be top of rigid insulation and the underside of the roof membrane in order to provide a solid and level substrate. Rigid insulation alone does not always provide this rigid insulation alone does not always provide a suitable substrate. We often find this requirement with PVC. We often find this requirement with single ply. We often find this requirement with single ply roofing systems like PVC or TPO. Just to reiterate, the roofing subcontractor will provide cladding products of any sort will provide the same material as the roofing membrane itself. Now this will occur when or are provided by the roofing subcontractor and or are furnished by the roofing manufacturer. Consists of a rubberized membrane that's fully adhered by the roofing subcontractor. Same material will need lead or compost. The roofing subcontractor will provide roof jacks for any steel. Clad metal consists of a rubberized membrane. This is because those roof jacks are actually furnished by the roofing manufacturer. More expensive than galvanized. However, this may include roof jacks for steel posts. Clad metal consists because the asphalt membrane will not adhere to a malleable steel. This is because he has copper or lead. This is because the asphaltic roofing, and when you get to these malleable flash are actually furnished by the roofing. The roof jacks are made of penetrations. These malleable flash are actually furnished by the roofing manufacturer. When we have roof jacks, anything has lead, and it will hit. And anything furnished by the roofing manufacturer themselves, it will adhere to lead and will adhere to copper. But it won't adhere to galvanized sheet metal. It makes this difficult to scope. May have refrigerant lines running from their scoping the PVC and TPO may have refrigerant. The roofing subcontractor may have refrigerant writing the bid instructions. These are often used in any TPO writing the bid instructions. They all just go to the roofing subcontractor cap flashings. But when we have one of these first, they use specifically call for them to provide their own roof jacks. That's when it gets complicated. If you don't direct them to do this, roofing subcontractors who will be providing roof jacks. Secondly, will not provide. If you have a built-up asphaltic roof, galvanized roof jacks that are not clad metal, because although the roof jacks are quite similar to other flashings, as those flashings will need lead or copper roof jacks, and they may even be the same material because the flashing is not clad roof. The reason for this is because of such as the parapet cap flashing, because the asphaltic roofing product will not adhere to galvanized differently than the other flashings. It will adhere to copper or lead. Let's go through a few examples. But it won't adhere to galvanized material. The roofing subcontractor will not provide sheet metal flashings. Now, this is actually the copper and lead material are both more expensive than galvanized. If a flashing is provided by the MEP subcontractors are not specifically directed to flashing is provided by the roofing manufacturer themselves, the roofing subcontractor will provide it. They're going to plan for galvanized sheet metal. If a flashing is not provided by the roofing manufacturer, so if the MEP subcontractors are not specifically directed to provide copper or lead flashings, So if the MEP subcontractors are not specifically directed to provide copper or lead roof jacks, they will plan to provide galvanized roof jacks in their base bids. And they'll send you a change order request for the upcharge of materials and you'll end up receiving a change order request for the change of materials. Next, we'll move on to discuss roof insulation thickness. Means the insulation can begin at 0 inches. The difference between a minimum means as long as the average thickness across the entire roof insulation is at least R30. Very important R30 at the roof drain. And using the example of so let me explain what this means. Using the same example, our value of roof insulation is given per using inch the same example of the insulation. So, for instance, if we're using an insulation product that has a value of R6, so for instance. Using the same example of an insulation product that has a value of R6 per inch, we'll need 5 inches. As long as the average thickness of insulation across the entire roof is 5 inches or more, this means the roof insulation thickness when we can begin the roof 5 inches at the roof drain and taper
and
up.
We can
from
begin
there.
the roofing insulation.
This is
at
the
0
definition
inches
of
at
a
the roof
minimum
drain.
of R30 roof insulation.
In this case, it's a savings of 5 inches of insulation across the entire roof area. This is a lot of insulation and very costly. Whether we need an average or minimum of R30 is not a specific building code requirement. It's actually the result of the project. It's actually determined by the project-specific Title 20. It's actually determined by the project-specific Title 24 calculations. Now whether we need an average or minimum of R30 is not always clear in the drawings, and this is a very common point of contention between architects and general contractors. We often only find this actually in the Title 24 calculations, which, to be honest, very few people read. Subcontractor, unless specifically directed otherwise, roofing bidders will always assume an average of R30 because it clearly makes their bids lower. If there's a later clarification, if later in the project if we receive a clarification later in the project that we need a minimum of R30, as opposed to the speculated average of R30, there's going to be a change order debate. Now, the general contractor might win this debate and get paid for the additional insulation, or they may not. But nevertheless, the best way to solve this problem is to prevent it. Look for this information in the drawings before bidding a project. If you can't find the information in the drawings, ask the architect prior to bidding the project. Make a conscious effort to look for this before bidding Make a conscious effort to look for this information when you're preparing your bid instructions. This can be a huge change order request from the roofing subcontractor. The metal panel subcontractor will also furnish within and at the perimeter because these guys pick up the sheet metal work. This is because we need those flashings within and at the perimeter of the aluminum flashing windows, storefronts, because these flashings will be by the glass subcontractor, not off the shelf. These flashings are concealed by within and at the perimeter. These flashings are not concealed by the flashing that may be from one metal panel to another shelf product. For instance, the perimeter of the metal panel applications and are often from the metal panels to any other facade. For this reason, these off-the-shelf products no flashing of the flashing between two different facade systems. Sill flashing is aluminum window flashings to the exterior are the most important flashings in scope. For instance, those are the flashings that are commonly overlooked flashing in instructions. If you happen to have a curtain wall, we have metal panels. For instance, a glass subcontractor will actually, for example, flashing a sill flashing on an aluminum wall needs to be picked up by either the metal panel or curtain wall subcontractor. A glass subcontractor will actually provide that flashing. Will be by the, and if it's not addressed, will be by the glass subcontractor. And if this isn't addressed, but instead hand flashing, neither of those subcontractors is likely to pick it up. The glass subcontractor would say that the other one is just in the bottom. That is just a simple galvanized sheet metal flashing and fully concealed. The glass subcontractor would actually provide the flashing from the base of curtain wall over the head and fully concealed behind the facade plaster is commonly provided by the flashing subcontractor. And also, now this can be and anytime you have a flashing, including a base flashing that is not an off-the-shelf product designed for plaster applications, that is not an off-the-shelf product. These flashings can be very difficult to scope products specifically designed for plaster applications, and every building subcontractor commonly. So the important thing, commonly the flashing drawings will provide review your flashings. So if that base flashing is actually each and every flashing for your project, so if that base specifically allocated, a base flashing at your plaster that's a custom flashing, specifically allocated in the bid instructions. Pick it up. Make sure those flashings are covered, but not double covered. Be sure all those flashings. Now, this may sound confusing. In a nutshell, it is. Be sure the flashings are covered. The point I want to get across here is to look at the drawings. In a nutshell, see what products are called out, and make your best. In a nutshell, and make a project-specific investigative effort throughout the drawings to be sure all flashings are covered, but not double covered. Flashings within
Architecturally
and at the perimeter.
significant
Flashings
within
within
GFRC
will always
perimeter
be provided by the flashing
Utilitarian
flashing
flashings,
such
masonry
as by
block
the
flashings,
could be by the
masonry
masonry
subs or flashing
subcontractors
subcontractors
or heavy
typically
facade
provided by the
system.
masonry subcontractor.
This division of
for your
work
heavier
in its facade systems will
This division
rarely
of
provide
utilitarian
base
flashings
flashings
will
will
never
never
be
be
acceptable
making
in
this
these
division of
devices.
work is based primarily
Utilitarian
on the
flashings are
architectural
not acceptable
significance
on
of
the
so it's the
facade.
flashing crews that
You
have
might
the
find these in a
expertise in
mechanical
providing
area
attractive
or at a
sheet
roof
metal.
penthouse.
So it's the flashing crews that have
These flashings are provided by the
it's the flat
and these are flashings that are commonly
the flashing
provided by
crews that
masonry
have the
material
expertise in
suppliers,
making-
and they're always spec'd in the
it's the
masonry
flashing crews that have the expertise
and
in
they're
providing
always spec'd and they're always specified in
it's
the
the flashing
masonry
crews that have the
specification
expertise
section.
in providing attractive sheet metal work. These flashings are provided by masonry material suppliers and they're specified in the masonry specification section.
Let me show you a few examples.
Louvers might be
This
provided
is
by
for
a
the
myriad of
mechanical
This is a
one.
photo
This is
of
vertical
vertical
by
horizontal
mechanical
cap over an
subcontractor.
equipment once again,
In this case,
including mechanical subs, sheet metal glass, metal
mechanical
board, even special subcontractors, mechanical subcontractors, flashing metal
like to
metal
allocate
plenum
the
flash
flashing
over the roofing
and
and
all
all
flashing
ceilings.
work.
I even like to allocate the if we have
Furthermore, it's always best to
I
keep
personally
waterproofing.
prefer if we have
and all
those, I
ceilings.
even like to allocate any
Focus
louvers
metal
that
cap
keep
over
match the
responsibility
glass
of
providing or
entire
metal panel
mechanical
assembly
subcontractor.
over the will be
Furthermore,
provided by
it's
the
always best
respective
to keep
glass or metal
waterproofing
panel
responsibility
subcontractor. They will
over
provide the
any element.
mechanical
Assembly
subs
above the roof
penetrating
curves
this
control.
sometimes flashed over the roof.
Remember,
If we just have a
mechanical
few
subs
louvers
penetrating this.
If we just have a few
Remember,
off-the-shelf
mechanical
louvers on a
subcontractor
project, we have a
will
duct
be- and they're
penetration
all
specifically
with
for
their
the
anchor
anchor
bolts.
mechanical subcontractor
And they're all
providing
specifically
for the mechanical
flashing
systems.
subcontractor
Remember,
providing
commonly
the
have a
mechanical
mechanical
subcontractor
subcontractor,
will
and then
pick
maybe
them
a
up.
caulking subcontractor caulking the flashing. If we have a
When they're
if we only have a few louvers on a project and
flashing
maybe half
the
of them
duct.
when they anchor their equipment,
We'll
if we
have-
only have a handful of louvers on a
When they're
project
anchoring
and
their equipment.
maybe only a
For
couple of them are
instance,
for the
if you
mechanical
really
work.
bolts used to
For instance,
It was
maybe
the
only a
bolts used
couple
to
of them
anchor
are
their
specifically for the mechanical work.
For example,
we might have the
if we were to
flashing
pick them
piecemeal
up if they're
of
just
duct penetration
off-the-shelf
through the
louvers.
roof. We could have a mechanical sub.
If we have a lot of
flashing
louvers
sub
on
and
a
a caulking
project,
sub, and they don't need to match a
could
glass
have a
or metal
mechanical
panel
sub.
system, we might have a specialty
We
louver
could have a mechanical
subcontractor
sub,
pick them
a
up. Sheet metal sub. Now, there's no steadfast rules
All
here.
responsible
It's
for
really
a
a
single roof
project-specific
penetration.
judgment call.
If
What
that
I just
roof
ran
penetration
were to leak, we would call
The
all
general
three
rules
rules of thumb that I just ran through.
all
are
three of
very
these
loose rules of
subcontractors
thumb.
would
show up to the site. The
see
point
the
I want to
leak,
get across here,
and each and every one of them
is take a
would
look
say,
at the louvers.
it must be the
and
other guy.
decide. It would be
And make
extremely and make your own
If you have multiple
project-specific judgment
subcontractors
call
responsible
as
for
to
a single
how
roof penetration, it is
as to who
extremely
the most
difficult to
appropriate
isolate
party is
who
to pick
is
up the
actually at
louvers.
fault for the leak.
This is why we always want to. This is why, whenever possible, we want to keep responsibility for waterproofing penetrations under the control of single subcontractors.